for joining us here today at the International House for our Global Forum collaboration with the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We're so excited to be back in person and look forward to being able to host more events for the Global Forum series later this quarter and in the future. My name is Anna, and I am currently the Global Forum Fellow. I assist with coordinating events with our partners, such as GPS. For any of you who are new or don't know, the Global Forum is a series produced by the International House, which is dedicated to discussing relevant topics in international affairs and multicultural issues to foster a globally minded community here on campus. Please be sure to fill out our participant survey after the presentation. It will be up on the slides during the reception, and we really appreciate all of your feedback and would love to hear what you thought of tonight's event and presentation. Thank you so much again for attending our presentation tonight. I will now introduce John Alquist, the Director for the Cowie Center on Global Transformation, to introduce the PLF program and our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. It's a much more pleasant night tonight than last night, so thank you for coming. So I'm John Alquist. I'm a faculty member here at GPS, and among other things, I also direct the Pacific Leadership Fellows program. So let me just take a moment to introduce you to the program. It's part of the Peter Cowie Center on Global Transformation, based here at UC San Diego, specifically in the School of Global Policy and Strategy. The center itself focuses on inquiry into two major transformations in the 21st century. First is how political governance is changing, and the second is how advances in science, technology, and analytic methods offer new opportunities to improve public policy and the distribution of wealth around the globe. We're taking up these themes with visiting fellows such as our PLF program, as well as faculty leaders, application-oriented researchers, and policymakers who come to UCSD or who we engage with in a variety of contexts. So I want to thank you all for your continued support and generosity, and particularly our founding supporters, Joan and Erwin Jacobs, as well as our dedicated staff. Thanks to them for always helping us pull these things off, and our colleagues and communities of scholars, friends, our current PLFs, and those from the past. So before I introduce our speaker for this evening, let me just quickly flag some future events so you'll know when to come. This is our last PLF event for the fall quarter, but in the winter, we will be having two different visitors. So in January, we will be having Carlos Viana. He's a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Brazil, and he's currently the head of research and a partner at Asset One Investment Company. And then in February, we will have a PLF, Zhonghua Li. He's the Dean of College of Political Science and Economics and the Dean of the Graduate School of Policy Studies at Korea University, and he's also the president-elect of the Korea Economic Association. So we'll have more details on those events coming up soon, but for just to let you know what's gonna happen for the rest of this evening, before I introduce our speaker, there will be kind of a 35-minute talk, and at the end, I will be turning the event over to my colleague, Nico Ravanilla, who will be conducting a Q&A and moderating that process. So, without further ado, I'm really thrilled to introduce our fabulous speaker for this evening. Marites Vitug is a leading Filipino journalist, investigative journalist, and author. She's currently the editor-at-large of Rappler and chair emeritus of the Journalism for Nation Building Foundation. She was the editor of Newsbreak magazine and an all-around trailblazer in the Filipino investigative journalism scene, which, as you might imagine, is a pretty exciting and volatile place to be. She's the author of numerous books, including Rock Solid, How the Philippines Won Its Maritime Case Against China, Shadow of Doubt, Probing the Supreme Court, which exposed critical weaknesses in the Philippines' highest court, The Power of the Forest, The Politics of Logging, and Under the Crescent Moon, Rebellion in Mindanao. So she's also the host of a series of podcasts, The Great Asian Pushback, which featured personalities who share their stories of defiance and hope in countries where democracy is under threat. She sits on the advisory board of Analyzing War, which is a US-based journal. She has been a fellow or a visitor at a variety of different institutes of higher education and policy around the Asia-Pacific region, as well as in the United States. And she is awarded the Courage in Journalism Award from the International Women's Media Foundation. So it's a lot of distinction there, and we're really thrilled to welcome her to come and talk to us this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much to the Pacific Leadership Fellows Program of the Center on Global Transformation for this great opportunity. I'm really excited to be here. So today I will be talking to you about my country, the Philippines, where we have a new president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., new yet old. And I'll focus, apart from explaining how the Marcoses returned to the Philippines, I'll focus on the issue of how he will navigate relations with the US and China, the rival superpowers. Well, he may be a new president, but he carries the history of his family, the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. and his wife Imelda Marcos, who is known internationally for her excesses, starting with her 3,000 pairs of shoes. So let me begin with a brief background of how the Marcoses were able to regain the presidency more than 30 years after their fall. Marcos Sr. was president for 20 years, from 1965 to 1986. Of these 2 decades, the country was under martial law for 14 years. He ruled with an iron hand, sent tens of thousands to jail, members of the opposition, journalists, labor leaders, student activists. Hundreds disappeared and thousands were killed. Marcos and his wife amassed billions in dollars from public funds and bought lavish properties in New York, New Jersey, and opened secret bank accounts in Switzerland. But the reign of Marcos was not to last. In 1986, a popular protest backed by the military, the Catholic Church, and many in the business community swept the Marcoses out of Malacanang Palace in what became known as the People Power Revolt. It was a heady time and a hopeful time, and it inspired countries in Eastern Europe to do the same. So we were very proud to be Filipinos then. Corazon Aquino, widow of the opposition leader who was assassinated during the Marcos regime, won a snap presidential election, and she presided over the Philippines' return to democracy, a very fragile transition period. Meanwhile, the Marcoses were exiled to Hawaii. Ferdinand, Imelda, and their 3 children, Aimee, Bongbong is the nickname of Ferdinand Jr., our current president, and Irene. The dictator died in Hawaii in 1989 without being held to account for plundering the country as well as the human rights abuses under his regime. So let me start with a timeline just to understand how the Marcoses were able to return, because people keep asking me, and I say it didn't happen overnight. So this is quite a story. It could be a series on Netflix. So the return of the Marcoses to the Philippines, to national and local politics, did not happen overnight. It began just 2 years after the death of Ferdinand Sr. Now this timeline will show how the Marcoses managed to reclaim Malacanang Palace, and it was a long road to the presidency of Bongbong Marcos. So let's begin in 1991 when Imelda came home. She was allowed by then President Corazon Aquino to return to face more than 60 criminal and civil charges against her, including graft and tax evasion. Then the next year, since she wasn't in prison, our judicial system runs so slowly, the next year, 1992, she ran for president and lost. She finished 5th in a field of 6 candidates. Their popularity was down at that time. That same year, Bongbong Marcos won as congressman in Ilocos Norte, the dictator's home province and political base. It was the first position a Marcos won after the People Power Revolt. Then in 1993, Corazon Aquino allowed the dictator's body back in the Philippines. I'm sorry, not Aquino. President Fidel Ramos, Aquino's successor, allowed the dictator's body back in the Philippines. However, Ramos rejected a state burial for the dictator, so that what the family did, that Marcos's body was enclosed in a glass vault and displayed at the Marcos Museum and Mausoleum in his province, Ilocos Norte. In 1995, Imelda made a comeback. She won as congresswoman in Leyte, her home province, where her relatives had wielded political influence for a long time. And then another loss came at the same year. Bongbong Marcos ran for the Senate and lost. So it's a series of ups and downs. And then in 1998, again, Imelda tried to run for president, but she eventually withdrew because she was lagging behind her rivals. And meanwhile, her children won positions in local government. Bongbong became governor of Ilocos Norte, serving for 3 terms or 9 years. Aimee won a congressional seat representing again their province, Ilocos Norte. And later in 2007, Bongbong Marcos was elected congressman, taking over from his sister. So it's a dynasty in action. And in 2010, finally, Bongbong Marcos was elected senator, his first national post, and he served until 2016. And then in 2013, mother and daughter, Imelda and Aimee, were re-elected, Imelda to Congress and Aimee as governor of their province. And in 2016, it was a painful year for them because Bongbong Marcos ran for vice president and lost. He lost to Leni Robredo, who also lost in the presidential elections. Anyway, but something happened in 2016 that helped pave the way for the further acceptance of the Marcoses. Thanks to President Duterte, the autocratic leader, he allowed the late dictator's remains to be buried in the Heroes Cemetery. It was a very controversial move, so the opposition filed a case with the Supreme Court to stop the burial, well, because Ferdinand Marcos was proven not to be a war hero. But the Supreme Court sided with Duterte, a Supreme Court who was packed with his appointees, and the disgraced leader joined the country's national heroes in the hallowed grounds we call Libingan ng Mga Bayani, or Heroes Cemetery. So finally, this year in May, Bongbong Marcos ran for president and won. Victory was theirs. So at first, the Marcos appeal seems puzzling. How can the name have such a pull after all that the late dictator had done to so many Filipinos? Let me just talk about 3 factors. By no means do this give a complete explanation of the successful laundering of the Marcos image, but they give us an idea why we got to where we are. So first, I think most important is our history books gloss over the dark years of martial law. Second, Marcos associated himself and allied himself with President Rodrigo Duterte, who happens to be the most popular president since polling began. And third, social media and disinformation. So let me discuss each of these factors. First, our history books. High school and college textbooks do not thoroughly discuss the Marcos years, what happened during martial law, and the excesses of that dark period. I was surprised when I spoke with some millennials, and I asked them how did they know about martial law, and they said from their parents, but they did not learn it from school, except for a few of their teachers who discussed martial law with them. It was a very surprising thing to learn. And there's an academic who studies errors in our textbooks, Antonio Caliphogo, and he cited one example. In one textbook, the bulk of the pages on martial law, only 18 pages, was devoted to the positive effects of the dictatorship, while only 2.5 pages deal with the negative consequences of martial law. Similarly, other textbooks either glossed over it or never mentioned it at all. That's why when we look at the story of Germany, I think the Philippines has a lot to learn, where standard German history texts chronicle the rise of Hitler to power in 1933 up to the Holocaust. There's a very interesting story written by the New York Times, and the reporter interviewed young Germans, and he said that many young Germans sense no personal guilt for a past generation's crimes, but they feel a responsibility to thwart any revival of their history's racism, militarism, and nationalism. So this is what our past governments have neglected. They did not shape the history curriculum of our schools, because after all, history should live in us. Second factor is the association and alliance with President Duterte. Despite his autocratic rule, Duterte is the most popular president in post-Marcos history. He was a populist and projected himself as not part of the elite, an outsider who would bring change. His daughter, Sara Duterte, is the current vice president who ran with Marcos as she was his running mate. So she provided a big boost to Marcos, who was initially not doing well in the surveys. But when Sara teamed up with Bongbong, Marcos's survey numbers rose. They became a very formidable team, backed by money, machinery, and political dynasties. So under Duterte, we had a very opaque, there was a lot of opacity. And the example set by Duterte made it easy for candidate Bongbong to shun transparency and accountability. Duterte is the first president in decades who refused to make public his asset statement as required by law. So taking the cue from Duterte, Marcos Jr. said during the campaign that he would not release his asset statement should he be president, claiming it can be used as a political weapon. After he was criticized for this, he flip-flopped and said, okay, he was willing to make his asset statement public. Let's see if he keeps this promise. And also during the campaign trail early this year, Bongbong was the least open among the presidential contenders. He rarely gave interviews to reporters covering him, and I even saw a rare ambush interview on video when journalists tried to ask him questions, and then his aides and guards quickly whisked him off. This has been the case during the campaign, and even our reporter tried to ask Marcos Jr. questions after a rally, but his aides and guards were rough. They blocked her, one of them even tightly holding her hand with the mobile phone as she was trying to get a video of the incident, and she was physically hurt. As maybe you have known if you have followed the campaign, Marcos snubbed a number of debates with his rival candidates, but chose to give interviews to partisans and friendly media. He has a network of vloggers, video bloggers, who amplify his messages and basically do propaganda work. So there is no need to impose martial law as his father did, because he has a hold over social media and with an army of video bloggers who amplify his messages. And this is related to the third factor, social media, particularly Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. The Marcoses have cleverly used social media to scrub their reputation. The new generation of Filipinos have been reached by the Marcoses through videos on YouTube and later TikTok. In fact, YouTube has been found to be a haven for disinformation. In April 2021, Rappler reported that lies about the wealth of the family of the late dictator continued to spread on YouTube without labels or warnings. This happened even though the claims have been previously fact-checked and historians denounced them as false. Even after Bongbong lost in his bid for the vice presidency in 2016, the Marcoses did not stop using social media. Another study on the YouTube algorithm and structure showed that they allow disinformation about the Marcos family and martial law to spread on their platform. A De La Salle University professor conducted a study and found 600 videos on YouTube that promoted the narrative that the Philippines was a great nation during the regime of the late dictator. The narrative further claimed that under Marcos's leadership, the country was an economic superpower, that his brand of democracy was the most just, that he was the most revered leader worldwide, and had available personal wealth for the benefit of the country's progress. And the final part of the narrative was that all of this can be achieved once again if another Marcos would be reinstalled into power. And related to that, a recent study shows that election disinformation since October 2021 up to mid-February this year has targeted Leni Robredo and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Robredo was the opposition candidate, but here's the big difference. Robredo was the subject of negative messaging, while Marcos was the subject of positive branding. So a fact-checking group from the academe, media, and civil society conducted a study, and in the case of Bongbong, a lot of the disinformation were false endorsements from celebrities and even heads of state, like New Zealand Prime Minister, who was said to have endorsed him when this was not true. So looking back at the election campaign, it turned out that Facebook was the biggest enabler of disinformation of all the social networking sites, followed by YouTube and TikTok. But there have been efforts to counter this disinformation. As I mentioned earlier, various groups from the media, academe, and civil society have gotten together to do fact checks. They have been doing good work, but it's like fighting a forest fire. Lies spread faster than fact checkers can manage to put out. Thus, there's a need for media literacy courses in schools and universities so that the public can understand how news organizations work and be more discerning about what is real and fake news. So having laid out the reasons, or at least some of the key reasons for the successful restoration of the Marcoses, I will now talk about the new President Marcos and foreign policy, particularly on dealing with the US and China. As you know, in September, President Marcoses visited the US to address the UN General Assembly. It was a homecoming of sorts as he returned to the country where his parents had bought properties with ill-gotten funds, one of which was his home while he was a student in Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania. But it was also the country that whisked him and his family out of Malacanang after they were booted out of power in 1986. It's also the country where he and his mother faced court cases. Imelda Marcos was eventually acquitted of fraud and racketeering by a New York court, but a Hawaii court had issued contempt charges against her and Bongbong, facing $350 million fine for contempt of court in the US after he failed to comply with rulings on disbursing the Marcos family assets. However, when Marcos became president, the State Department said and announced that he enjoys diplomatic immunity as head of state, allowing him to set foot in the US. In fact, when Marcos visited New York in September, he said that this is his first trip to New York in 22 years. It was a stunning, actually, comeback. So initially, I thought that Marcos would have a love-hate relationship with the US, considering his personal history. But when we followed his speeches, he went all out for America, swinging the pendulum after former President Duterte's open hostility toward America. So just for a bit of background, Duterte made a dramatic pivot to China when he won in 2016, declaring openly his love for China and for Xi Jinping. And he said, because we need to get money for investments and aid. So anyway, in New York, I religiously followed Marcos's speeches, and in a lunch meeting with the U.S.-Philippine Society on September 19, he said, and I quote, "I do not see a future for the Philippines that does not include an even stronger partnership with the U.S. Our formal partnership of 70-plus years in terms of the defense treaties must continue to evolve as the geopolitical situation changes." He repeated this and more during the open forum after his talk at the New York Stock Exchange. I think for us Filipinos who have been used to 6 years of Duterte, we were shocked that our president was saying good things about the US. So, let's see how this goes. But again, he swung the pendulum and he said, and I quote, Marcos said, "It is very clear to me in my vision for the way that the country will move forward that I cannot see the Philippines in the future without having the US as a partner. I cannot overstate the role that the US has played in every aspect of our lives. When we are in crisis, we look to the US, we look to the relationship that has been forged over the many years, and I have to say that the reason we have done this is that for the most part, we can say that the US has not failed us." So it was sort of a love fest between Marcos and the US. Then he had a meeting with Biden at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. And again, the atmosphere was warm, the words were very cozy and very friendly, and this is what Marcos said. We feel that we are especially fortunate because we have very strong foundation of a very long relationship and strong relationships on various facets, not only political, not only economic, not only diplomatic, but also economic. We are your partners, we are your allies, we are your friends. And in like fashion, we have always considered the US our partner, our ally, and our friend. So Marcos was very effusive about the US, but I think this seems to be his way. In June, weeks into assuming the presidency, he was also effusive about China. He said this at an event organized by the Association for Philippines-China Understanding in June. And come to the day when we can say we are beyond the economic crisis brought on by the pandemic, certainly in the Philippines, we can only do it with our partners, and our strongest partner has always been, in that regard, our close neighbor and our good friend, the People's Republic of China. But in fact, our strongest partner was Japan, and also the US, who gave us millions of doses of vaccines. But I will not be surprised if in a future trip to Beijing, Marcos will heap praises on China, similar to those he heaped on the US. After all, it was his father who opened ties with China in 1975. And before the presidential campaign, Bongbong was a frequent guest of the Chinese ambassador in Manila. So the way I see it, Bongbong will try to balance relations between the two global powers and rivals, very much unlike his predecessor, Duterte. The question is, and this will be answered maybe in the next year, let's see how it flows, will he be able to deftly manage this? So since it's just a few months into his presidency, we will have to look at how he will handle them in concrete. So beyond words, one early test of Marcos will be his response to China's harassment of Philippine ships surveying for oil and gas in the Reed Bank area in the West Philippine Sea, which is what we call our part of the South China Sea. And the Reed Bank falls within our exclusive economic zone, but China refuses to acknowledge this. Our giant neighbor continues to covet this reef that is said to contain huge reserves of oil and gas. So just as a brief background, in 2016, the Philippines won its maritime case versus China, where an international tribunal decided that China's historical claims to the South China Sea are illegal. So back to today, the Philippines is facing an energy crisis as gas from a major source, the Malampaya gas field, will run out in 3 to 5 years. And during Duterte's last months in office, he ordered a stop to the survey activities because China wanted to be a partner in this exploration deal. However, by that time, negotiations with China had fallen through because China did not agree to the Philippine position that only a service contract was the constitutional means for such a partnership. A service contract means that if China agrees to it, they would recognize Philippine sovereign rights over the area. So they refused to sign the agreement, and there had been an impasse. And now there have been calls for Marcos to give the go signal to drill for oil and gas in Reed Bank without China's participation. And in fact, the Philippines can go one step further and partner with other countries like European countries like Spain or the US. How Marcos will decide on this will be an early test of how he will navigate relations with China. In fact, the Philippines can learn from our neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia. They have successfully drilled oil in waters claimed by China despite pressure and harassment from the regional giant. Brief background, in 2019, Malaysia sent its commissioned survey ship to explore in its own EEZ off the coast of Borneo, an area which China claims. China warned Malaysia not to proceed with the exploration, and China sent its Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels to shadow the Malaysian ship. In return, Malaysia sent its Navy and Coast Guard vessels to accompany their survey ship. So, in what seemed like a show of solidarity, 3 American warships and an Australian frigate conducted a joint exercise near the site of Petronas operations. This was during the standoff, which had been going on for months. And then a month late, after the standoff, the Malaysian ship finished its work and left the waters. Another incident in Malaysia showed that it behaved boldly. In 2021, while Petronas was working on a gas field in Malaysia's EEZ in the South China Sea, Chinese Coast Guard boats started to arrive in the area. Malaysia's foreign ministry filed protests against China, but they didn't stop there. They sent again their Navy ships as well as Coast Guard ships to watch over the gas field. Petronas was able to complete its drilling. Similarly with Indonesia, same in 2021, they were exploring off the coast of Natuna Islands facing the South China Sea, an area claimed by China. The Chinese told Indonesia to stop, but Indonesia was determined, and it resulted in a standoff between the Indonesian Coast Guard and Navy ships and Chinese Coast Guard vessels. But Indonesia was determined and completed its drilling. This has never happened in the Philippines under the 6 years of Duterte. The Philippine survey ship was only successful for a few months in exploring, and then they had to stop because China harassed them, and the Philippines did not show any sign of support. So the question is, will Marcos learn from Malaysia and Indonesia? That's a big question that we all want answered. So in conclusion, it's still really early days. Marcos is on the 4th month of his presidency, but what bears watching is this. Will he be able to sustain a balancing act between China and the US? There is bound to be tension along the way as Chinese ships continue to intrude into the West Philippine Sea. They keep shadowing Philippine Coast Guard boats patrolling the area, even harassing civilian boats that bring supplies to Filipino soldiers. But the Philippines stands on the might of its legal victory, which then President Benigno Aquino acted on to when he hauled China to court, when the tribunal decided that China's historic claim to a large part of the South China Sea is without basis. But of course, China has rejected this ruling and it stands on the might of its military and economic power. The way I see it, violent conflict erupting between the Philippines and China is remote, but we expect tensions to simmer on and off and linger as China has already normalized its presence in the West Philippine Sea. They'll never leave, they'll continue to be there, so we'll see how Marcos will deal with this. How he will sustain this high-wire act and navigate our maritime dispute with China will be a defining moment in his presidency. So I'll end here and thank you, and I look forward to our conversation later.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nico Ravania. I am an assistant professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. Among other things, I study the Philippines. I was born and raised there, so clearly I have my personal interest in studying the country, but also I am studying generally what are the causes and consequences of poor governance in the country. Tonight, I will be your moderator for the Q&A. So, Marites, before I give the floor to our audience here, let me, get started with one question about domestic politics in the Philippines. So we have just witnessed the first 100 years. 100 days, not 100 years. That would be super bad for any president. 100 days of Marcos' presidency. From your observation, having stayed in the Philippines for I guess, that 100 days, do we have any reason to be, I guess, cautiously optimistic about his administration 3 years in, 6 years in?
Yeah, first, one of the good moves of Marcos Jr., I never thought I'd say something positive about him, but he has appointed a good economic team. They're known in their fields. You know them. They're economists from the University of the Philippines. The finance secretary, who's the leader of the economic team, the central bank governor, the economic planning secretary, the trade and industry secretary, they're all known in their fields, well respected. So that was a good sign. We have a team of technocrats. But if, again, we look back to his father's days, how far will the technocrats go, you know, when they see if there's corruption or poor governance? But that's the good point. There are weak appointments in the justice sector, in the education sector. So in the social issues, it's not that strong. Except in the Environment and Natural Resources Department, for the first time, we have a climate change expert, academic, so we are hopeful for that department and for the more attention to be brought to climate change. So that's the positive and the negative. It's only 100 days, no?
Okay, so it sounds like there's reason to be cautiously optimistic,
but
wait some more.
We have to wait, but also the weak side is that Marcos Jr. seems not to be as decisive as he should be because we're in a crisis, economic crisis. We need to know where we're going, how to live with the COVID. He has not appointed a health secretary, so it's weird that when a reporter asked him, Mr. President, how come you have not appointed a health secretary? And he said, well, when things normalize, I'll appoint one. So it's like going to a doctor after you recover. You know? So it's just weird. So, but you know, again, I'll say this. I have to differentiate Marcos from his predecessor because we've had 6 years of living under Duterte with his violent war on drugs, his day-to-day cursing, his toxic conversations. So, as I was telling Nico earlier, I think we came from the gutter. So when we heard Marcos Jr. in his State of the Nation address, not cursing, not threatening to kill us, not threatening journalists or lawyers or whatever, we felt such huge relief. And he also sticks to his prepared texts. He doesn't meander. So again, oh my God, what a relief. It doesn't take 2 hours, just an hour. And little things, as I said, please understand we came from the gutter. So we're a bit up, the bar is so low. He wakes up at 7 o'clock in the morning compared to Duterte who would wake up past lunch. And all his appointments, he'll be late and he talks to the nation at close to midnight and the journalists are all tired. And anyway, in terms of style, we're relieved. And he differentiates his program on drugs from Duterte. He said this because he doesn't give interviews to legitimate media in the Philippines, but he gave an interview to AP in New York and Bloomberg. And he's told AP that his drug war will be different because he will focus on the suppliers, not the small-time peddlers, on the big-time suppliers, and he will focus on rehabilitation. So they are cautiously optimistic, and well, of course, let's see on the 200 day.
Right. We wait some more, I guess. Okay, I have some more questions, but I think I'll open it up to the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Someone will approach you with a microphone. And if you could just please quickly introduce yourself and then ask your question, that would be great.
Good evening. Blaise Narcissi. Does the Philippines have any regret regarding when the U.S. naval facility left the Philippines? Thank you.
If the U.S. has any regrets about the departure of the bases?
If the Philippines had any regrets.
Yeah, well, yes. I've spoken to some experts, academics, analysts. Looking back, they said that before we kicked out the bases, we should have had an alternative plan, a strategic plan, 5 to 10 years. Because when the bases left in 1992, China took over one of our reefs and islands, Mischief Reef in 1995. And the military was shocked, the defense establishment, and they said, well, lesson learned, next time, let's plan for ourselves, strengthen our own military, and not just be driven by the passions of the moment. So, but I don't know if that is a nationally shared regret, but this is among the security analysts, some politicians, and in the academy.
We have someone here.
Hi, Marites. Thank you so much for your talk, and thank you for being a fellow here at UCSD. My name is Jody Blanco, and I teach in the literature department, also here at UCSD. I'm also the director of Latin American Studies. And my question is, two questions, really. One was, the issue that you brought up with the neglect of history books to teach martial law. I wondered if it is neglect or it's collusion, because it seems to me that, there would have been plenty of opportunities to write martial law into the history textbooks if there was a will. And I wonder if it's not a question of just oversight on the part of the government, but actually people over the years who, for various reasons, have active interests in not promoting the dark side of martial law in the Philippines. And that's the first question. The second question is a broader one, which has to do with, we mentioned Indonesia and Malaysia, and I'm wondering if the Association of Southeast Asian Nations as a group has had any conversation about how to deal with China in terms of policy. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah, thanks for your questions. The first question is making me think now. Maybe, yeah, that may be a factor because there are people in government who were part of the martial law apparatus, so there may be there was no interest, there was no will to really look at our textbooks. But when I talked to a recent education secretary, this was during Aquino's time, brother, I forgot his name. Anyway, I asked him, I said, why didn't you, at least the Department of Education, start reviewing history textbooks? And he said, the priorities were classrooms, teachers, like it wasn't of the present. And I also asked another former education official, and he said, yeah, we were always thinking of classrooms, teachers, access to education. That it seemed like a luxury. So that's one of the reasons. But now thinking also about what you said, that may have been a factor. Yeah. And the second question on ASEAN, there have been several discussions on China, but sad to say, the ASEAN can never have a united position on China because China, Laos, Cambodia, they're very close to China, while Vietnam, Philippines are the most anti-China because we have maritime claims. That's why there's no proposal for, they call minilaterals, like claimant countries, just to get together and put a position and discuss this with China, but it's not taken off because ASEAN is always seen as the main body. But we will never get to unite when it comes to China. It only happened in 1995 when China took over Mischief Reef, and at the time China wasn't that powerful yet, 1995. So ASEAN was united in a statement supporting the Philippines against China.
Hi, great talk, and thank you for that conversation we had a couple of days earlier too. I have a question about the Philippine society and the general public, sort of moving away a little bit from the elites, from the Marcoses and Duterte, etc. That is, Philippines is democracy, And supposedly what the public thinks and where the public interests are will influence somewhat what Marcoses will do with respect to China. So can you break it down for us in terms of the specific interests in business or geopolitical and other kind of interests that might affect how his next move might be with respect to China, as well as with respect to the US?
Yeah, okay. There are annual surveys for the general public on what is the attitude towards China, but very specific. The question is, do you want the Philippine government to assert sovereign rights over West Philippine Sea? And that's 80+% yes. So that's very clear. That's why Duterte at one point had to appease public opinion by saying that in one of his visits to China, he announced to the Philippine audience that he was going to bring it up, the arbitral tribunal. And then Marcos, in his State of the Nation address and his other speeches, keeps repeating that he said, as president, he will not preside, he will not allow a square inch of territory to be taken over by a foreign power. That's obviously referring to China. So that's the popular survey. Among the business community, it's very pragmatic. There are a number of Philippine businesses that have offices in China. So they're pushing for relations that are not focused on South China Sea. So they want a parallel track. Let's talk trade, investments, economy. Let's separate this. And I think Marcos will listen to them because they belong to the big business community. But there's also this sector of the fishermen who are harassed by Chinese vessels. And although they're not a huge population, but it's a gut issue for them, and they really talk to the media, their videos, they talk about how Chinese Coast Guard vessels harass them, that they are losing their livelihood, there's overfishing. So that's also one sector. So Marcos can be pulled into different directions. But there's also a new thing, not a new thing, but a recent development, because Duterte really pushed for loans from China. But the thing is, can China now afford to give more loans with its own economic crisis? And that's why the Philippine government, in the last 3 months of Duterte, withdrew its loan applications for 3 major railway projects. And according to our finance secretary, it was because China had increased the interest rate. But in reality, Japan has always had lower interest rate. But under Duterte, the policy was to get loans from China. So we will be pulled in different directions, but Marcos said that, okay, if we don't get, let's pursue loans from China, but let's also pursue public-private partnerships, which Duterte did not, it wasn't part of his agenda. So that's why it will be, it's really hard for me to imagine Marcos having to make bold decisions at this time. I think he's trying to also have a sense of all these publics and which one is going to be the most influential, which he will listen to.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions here, and then we go back to the ladies in front.
Thanks very much. Steve Clary from the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at UCSD. Nico, nice to see you. How strong a voice will the military have in the Marcos government relative to military relations with the United States, military concerns about China's aggressive foreign policy, and how big a voice and large a voice will they have?
Yeah, very interesting question, because that's one of the reasons why Duterte could not fully sell Chinese China-Philippine military-to-military activities. Is because the relations between the Philippine defense and the U.S. military have been so deep that in fact, they had more activities during the Duterte administration. They had more joint activities, and there's an increase under Marcos. So it's very difficult to promote like friendly or more deep relations between China PLA and the Philippine military. So it's a stronghold. I mean, they have been dealing with the US for many, many years. They went to school in West Point, in Annapolis, and now they're going to school in Australia. And then there are more activities now because with Marcoses' announcement of friendlier ties with the US announced more military aid. So I think China, for the security aspect, it won't be as strong as Duterte, but let's see for the economic aspect.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is about the election, why Bongbong Marcos got elected. And during the election season, there were lots of trolls from the Marcos campaign, basically putting the opposition as something that they're not to be. And that has put the Liberal Party in a position where they have nicknames such as Dilawan or these false narratives about them. How can the Liberal Party and the opposition in the Philippines change the narrative and get rid of all these false statements that was made against them? And then my second question is, all right, I guess you can answer the first question first.
Yeah, so how the opposition, how can it dismantle that narrative? Oh, it's very difficult. First, they have to organize themselves. During the campaign of Leni Robredo, they were starting to, the youth was getting to be a big part of the opposition in that sense, no? But now, after Marcos won, I don't seem to see a lot of organizing going on in the opposition. The Liberal Party, as you know, has been decimated, but there's a new leader, Congressman Lagman, but they have to go beyond the politicians and I think tap the youth, which really was a big factor in the Leni Robredo campaign. So it's difficult. They have to organize themselves first. Marcos won by 31 million votes. The president with the third largest share, Magsaysay, Quezon, Magsaysay, and Marcos. So, there's a lot. I think they should do a lot of self-reflection first, before they can do something as big as destroy that narrative.
And then the second question I have is, you kind of alluded to it before with ASEAN and how there's never a joint statement against China, but other countries in ASEAN, such as Malaysia, have been able to successfully renegotiate their loan terms, especially in China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I was curious if ASEAN would act together as a union to on an economic front to renegotiate those loan terms, or can the Philippines do that individually?
No, I think when it comes to BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, and loan terms, it's our bilateral activity. We have experienced, among the Southeast Asian countries, I think the Philippines has the least involvement in BRI because it's only happened under Duterte. And we're still not, the Philippine bureaucracy is also adjusting to China's bureaucracy. We're more attuned to dealing with Japan, because we've been borrowing from them, and with ADB. So anyway, it's a learning process. And again, but we'll see, it's mainly bilateral.
This is a follow-up question to the military question that was asked before. What about a NATO-like organization in ASEAN? Maybe not with all Asian countries, but maybe with the ones which are most threatened. After all, it has worked in the EU. Some countries haven't been invaded by Russia, Lithuania, Estonia. So how about building such an alliance whereby if one is attacked, the other will
So perhaps like the Quad could be a potential version of that NATO-like organization. Is that possible in the region?
It's not yet in the conversation of ASEAN. I mean, I've heard this from academics, but what's happening now is that, like in Southeast Asia, it's the Philippines and Thailand, which are treaty allies of the US. So it's very clear now in the Philippines that if a Philippine vessel is attacked in the West Philippine Sea, that the U.S., because it's a treaty ally, will come to the defense of the Philippines. That was unclear before. But when the Chinese started sending maritime militia and their Coast Guard and Navy, I think the Philippine president started to ask, our defense secretary started to ask, is the West Philippine Sea part of where you will come to our aid? If it is and it has become very clear under Trump's foreign secretary came to Manila and made it clear, and then Blinken also repeated it. So that NATO type of organization, I think it's still remote. It's just a more treaty-to-treaty relationship.
So we have a couple of questions from the ladies in front. Okay.
Hello, my name is Ian Cervelo. My question is relating to, I believe the International Criminal Court intends to pursue the investigation of human rights abuses under the previous administration. And do you have any insight as to what Bongbong Marcos stands on this? Although I think I know. But, and secondly, would this have a bearing on the Philippine relations or international relations of the Philippines with vis-a-vis the US and other countries? Thank you.
Marcos, even during the campaign, has said that he will not cooperate with the ICC when it comes to investigating Duterte and his allies, because Duterte was really a big factor in his victory. I mean, he was really trying to get the Duterte votes. And now that he's president, he said the same thing. He will not cooperate. The Philippine government will not cooperate because we have our own judicial system, it's working, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be difficult for the ICC to investigate using official documents. So we'll see how that prospers and how will it affect our relations. I think more with the US, they're not a signatory anyway. But human rights is a big issue when it comes to the European Union. And that's why the Philippine Justice Secretary is trying to he's making the position that the Philippine government will respect human rights, and there is already like a technical cooperation, but we need to hear a stronger voice from Marcos on human rights. We need to hear this from him more than just his Justice Secretary, because Marcos speaks with a strong voice on the economy. It's mainly the economy, maybe China, West Philippine Sea, but when it comes to human rights issues, we don't hear. I don't know, maybe he hasn't framed his answers yet on that.
Hi, I'm Marites. Marites, I'm Mariví Soliven. I just wanted to ask you, because I was in Manila a few days before the election. I left because magulo. And there just seemed to be such a sense of hope, like there are hundreds of thousands of people attending Leni Robredo's rally and everything. So I was just wondering, was this a phenomenon of Manila and the upper middle classes, or were the elections stolen? What was your sense of, well, that's kind of a silly question for the Philippines, but was there rampant stealing of votes, or we had heard like, rumors that Marcos had bribed every single mayor in the country with X amount of pesos?
Yeah, I think the surveys show that Leni Robredo was strong among the middle class, and that Bongbong Marcos' support cut across all, from the rich to the poor. So it shows that the phenomenon of the we call them the mini EDSAs,
yes.
But it was not just a Metro Manila. The good thing about Leni Robredo's campaign was it was not just a Metro Manila phenomenon.
Yes.
And the analysts were saying if the campaign maybe took 2 or 3 months more, then she would have made maybe even won or very close to winning it. So everything was late. She decided late. the house-to-house campaigns, which were proven effective, started late, and it showed that the preparation of the Marcoses, we couldn't beat that. Years of social media disinformation, and of course the resources. And although there is no study yet, evidence that they bought votes, but past elections always shows that vote buying is common. And there are already techniques to monitor, in a village, in a small village, in a barangay, if there are 100 people paid to vote for Marcos, then if the only 80 voted, then they would know the names of those who did not vote. So there's already that kind of monitoring. Although for this election, there's no study yet, but past elections show vote buying has always been rampant, very, very common.
So maybe room for one more, or are we all set? Okay, one more.
I was wondering whether the population of the Philippines is kind of leans more towards like an alliance with the United States, or whether they would like an alliance more with China in terms of the population. And then, the pictures we see in the United States of the 80s is this like people power movement, right? And I just was wondering, what happened to that after 1986? Where did it go? Did it just dissipate? Was there no organization because of like suppression of labor unions? Like, where did that energy go?
Wow. Anyway, the first question, it's popular opinion in the Philippines. There's an annual poll. Which countries do you trust most? And they're given countries to rank. China is like negative. Consistently, you can go to social weather stations' website. They will see it. They track it down. And there are years that they go a bit up, but it's always negative. So US and Japan are the most trusted.
Which is ironic because Duterte was popular, right? But he pivoted to China.
Yes, but that's the puzzle, because people seem to separate Duterte from his, they like him for his violent drug war. He was cleaning up. They said that crimes were reduced, street crimes. They liked him for his jokes, for his being an outsider, for being, giving, helping the poor during the pandemic. It was, they call it ayuda, help. Local governments gave cash to the poor families, but Duterte was the image there, that he was the one giving the money to the poor. So despite our longest lockdown in the world, he was still remained popular. So that's the thing. The other one is, where did people power go? Well, after 1986, we had another people power in 1991, but that wasn't as huge as 1986. And then in 1993, we had a counter people power when the poor, the followers of Joseph Estrada marched to Malacanang. So, but I think people have gotten tired of this. So now we wanted to rely on institutions. So we have, if we want to have an amendment to a constitution, there's a means to do that by you sign, so you get so many signatures. So there are now new forms of popular participation. But I don't think we'll return to that people power, because many have been disillusioned that despite the popularity of the EDSA revolt in 1986, institutions have rarely, improved. The same names are around, the politicians. So there's a lot of reflection that has gone on about this. So where do we need to change? What do we need to do? So I don't think we'll go back to that magical era.
Well, on that note, we ran out of time, so thank you so much, Marites, for that fascinating talk. We can continue our conversation with some refreshments, so please, you're welcome to stay and talk to our speaker. Thank you so much, everyone.